In the summer of 1998, three teenage girls checked into a hotel in Atlantic City for a graduation celebration. They were captured on security footage laughing in the lobby at 10:12 p.m. By morning, their room was empty, the beds untouched, their belongings gone. For 25 years, no trace of Emily Carter, Jessica Blake, or Megan Foster was ever found, until a construction crew broke ground on a condemned shopping mall 2 miles from the boardwalk and unearthed something that would force investigators to reopen a case they thought had gone cold forever. The morning Donna Reyes disappeared from the Ocean View Suites, the hotel was running a breakfast special on waffles. The smell of vanilla batter and warm syrup drifted through the lobby like a promise, mingling with the salt-heavy air that came off the Atlantic every morning from October through April. It was the kind of smell that made people lower their shoulders and breathe slowly. It made them feel safe. At the front desk, a young man named Derek was explaining to an older couple from Ohio that yes, the boardwalk was open year-round, and yes, the lights were still beautiful even in the off-season. Maybe more so, because without the summer crowds, you could actually hear the ocean. The couple nodded. The woman touched her husband's arm. Outside, a gray Atlantic City morning pressed itself flat against the glass revolving doors. Nobody at the Ocean View Suites noticed that Donna Reyes, 22, was not at breakfast. Nobody noticed that her two friends, Kim Baxter and Rachel Ortiz, were not at breakfast either. The three women had checked in 2 days earlier for a bachelorette weekend. Kim was getting married in the spring. They had matching sashes. They had taken photographs in the lobby with a bottle of champagne. The photographs were later recovered from Kim's phone, which was found inside the room on the nightstand, its screen cracked but intact. The battery had died sometime Saturday night. Housekeeping entered room 318 at 11:43 in the morning, after receiving no response to their knock. The beds were made, not hotel-made, but made the way someone makes a bed when they are trying to leave a room exactly as they found it. The towels in the bathroom were folded on the rack. The champagne glasses from Friday night had been rinsed and set upside down on the courtesy tray. The suitcases were open on their stands, clothes still folded inside, toiletries still arranged beside the sink in the bathroom. Donna's insulin pen was on the nightstand beside Kim's phone. She would never have left without it. She was type 1 diabetic. She had never once in her adult life left a room without that pen. The housekeeping attendant, a 53-year-old woman named Marisol, who had worked at the Ocean View for 11 years, stood in the center of that perfectly arranged room and felt something cold move through her. Not the cold of an open window. The window was closed and latched. Something else. The cold of a space that had been deliberately emptied of all the evidence that three young women had ever been there. Someone had cleaned this room without cleaning it at all. Someone had made it look as if three women had simply evaporated, taking everything that would explain their presence and leaving behind everything that would underline their absence. Marisol called the front desk. The front desk called the manager. The manager called the Atlantic City Police Department at 12:17 on a Sunday afternoon in March. The waffle special ended at noon. The smell of vanilla had already faded from the lobby by the time the first officer walked through the revolving doors. The three women were never found. Not that year, not the year after, not for a very long time. 25 years is long enough for a city to forget almost anything. Atlantic City had forgotten the Ocean View girls, as the local press had briefly called them, within 18 months. There were other disappearances, other crises, other headlines. The casino industry contracted and expanded and contracted again. Buildings were demolished. Buildings were raised from nothing. The boardwalk swallowed and renewed itself in the way that cities built on spectacle always do, covering the last version of themselves with a brighter, louder version, until the original is buried so far beneath the surface that only the foundation knows it was ever there. The Ocean View Suites became the Coastal Crown Resort in 2009. It underwent a full interior renovation that gutted the third floor and replaced the original plumbing infrastructure with a modern system. In 2024, the Coastal Crown was itself slated for partial demolition to make way for a mixed-use development. The eastern wing, which included what had once been the housekeeping corridors behind the third-floor guest rooms, was the first section to come down. A construction crew supervisor named Tony Galvez was the one who found it. He told the police later that he had noticed the discrepancy in the wall measurements 3 days before he broke through. The corridor outside what was originally room 317 was 11 feet wide on the blueprints. In reality, it measured 9 feet 2 inches. He assumed a renovation error. He broke through with a standard sledgehammer on a Tuesday morning at 7:45, and the wall gave way to reveal a space approximately 8 feet deep and 14 feet long, sealed completely. No ventilation, no electrical connection to the main building grid, lit by a battery-powered lantern that had long since died. The walls of that space were covered from floor to ceiling with photographs. Hundreds of them, layered in places 3 and 4 deep, held with industrial staples, their edges curled with age and the particular damp of a sealed concrete space. Most of the photographs showed young women. All of them appeared to have been taken without the subject's knowledge. Restaurants, casino floors, hotel lobbies, a pier, a parking structure. Some of the photographs showed women in locations that Tony Galvez did not recognize, interiors he could not place, rooms with low ceilings and bare walls, and a quality of light that came from something artificial and inadequate. On the floor of the sealed room sat 3 backpacks. Tony Galvez called the police before he touched anything else. He stood in the opening he had made in the wall and looked at those 3 backpacks and felt the same thing Marisol had felt in room 318 25 years earlier. Something cold. Something that moved through a person and did not leave. Detective Sarah Miller received the call at 8:22 on a Tuesday morning. She was on her second coffee, standing at her kitchen counter reading about a water main break on Pacific Avenue, and her phone rang and a voice said, "There's something you need to see." She put down the coffee. She put down the phone. She stood completely still for 3 seconds, and then she picked up her keys. She had been waiting for this call, in one form or another, for 15 years. She did not know that yet. She would understand it only later, much later, when the shape of the thing became visible enough to see all at once. The backpacks were identified through their contents within 48 hours. A wallet with a driver's license inside. A prescription card for insulin made out to Donna Reyes. A small beaded bracelet with the word bride written on it in plastic letters, the kind sold at bachelorette party supply stores. Kim Baxter's name was written in permanent marker on the inside of the bracelet's clasp. 3 women, 3 backpacks, 3 lives packed and abandoned in a sealed room in a demolished hotel corridor. And at the bottom of Rachel Ortiz's backpack, wrapped carefully in a hotel laundry bag, 3 notebooks. Sarah Miller sat in a conference room at the Atlantic City Police Department on a Wednesday evening and opened the first notebook with a caution that was not professional protocol. It was something more personal, more reluctant. The notebook had a red cover and Rachel Ortiz's name written on the inside front page in careful block letters. Beside the name, a date, March 14th, 1999. The entries began with the ordinary. Rachel writing about Kim's excitement, about the casino floor, about a man they had seen at the hotel bar, who Rachel described as watching them in a way that did not feel like regular watching. She used that phrase twice in the first entry. Not regular watching. As if she had tried to find a more precise word and failed. The second entry was dated March 15th. Rachel described waking up in a room she did not recognize. Concrete walls, no windows, a mattress on the floor, and a door that was metal and locked from the outside. Kim was beside her, unconscious but breathing. Donna was not there. Rachel wrote that she had screamed until her throat bled, and no one had come. Sarah Miller read that line 4 times and set the notebook down and pressed both hands flat on the conference table and breathed. Rachel Ortiz had been 20 years old. She had been a junior at Rutgers, studying environmental science. She had been afraid of spiders, but not of much else, according to her mother, who had told Sarah this in a phone call that Sarah had placed herself, 3 hours after the backpacks were identified. Rachel's mother was 71 now, and she had answered the phone, and Sarah had said her name, and the woman had gone completely silent. And in that silence, Sarah had understood something about the weight of 25 years of not knowing. The notebooks continued. 48 entries across the 3 women's journals, spanning 6 months. They had been held in at least 2 separate locations. They had been moved twice. They had developed a system of communication, passing the single notebook between them, because Rachel had been the one who had the notebook in her backpack when they were taken, leaving it in places where the others could reach it. The notebook had traveled between them like a contraband letter, carefully hidden, carefully maintained, the handwriting shifting between Rachel's block letters and Kim's looping cursive and Donna's precise medical school-adjacent print. The last entry was dated September 3, 1999. It was in Donna's handwriting. It read, "If you find this, please tell our families we didn't give up. Tell them we looked for every way out. Tell them we thought about them every single day. Tell them we were not alone at the end." Sarah Miller did not sleep that night. She sat in the conference room until 4 in the morning, reading every entry, making notes, building the thing in her mind the way a structural engineer builds a model before they touch a single beam. She was looking for the architecture of it, the system, because this was not a crime of impulse or opportunity. This was infrastructure. This had been planned and built and maintained over time by someone who understood the physical spaces of this city better than most people understood their own homes. 15 years earlier, Sarah had worked a case involving 2 missing teenagers from a casino hotel in Philadelphia. She had followed the wrong lead for 11 weeks. She had focused on a former boyfriend, while the actual perpetrator, a building contractor who had done renovation work on 4 separate casino hotels in the Mid-Atlantic region, had moved the girls twice and then disappeared entirely. The girls had never been found. The contractor had never been charged. Sarah had been a junior detective, and everyone told her it was not her fault, and she had never once believed them. She believed, sitting in that conference room at 4 in the morning with Rachel Ortiz's words in her hands, that she was finally looking at the same architecture she had missed 15 years ago. Bigger now, older, more deeply embedded in the surfaces of things, but the same. The notebooks gave Sarah a physical vocabulary. Pipes above the ceiling that ran north to south. The sound of a freight elevator, not a passenger elevator, operating at irregular intervals. A smell that Rachel had described with her environmental science background as sulfuric and mineral. The smell of groundwater filtration or industrial water treatment. A sound, noted by Kim in an entry from late May, of what she thought was a slot machine. Not the sounds of a busy casino floor. A single machine, running through its cycle, pausing, running again, like a maintenance test. Sarah pulled the renovation permits for every major Atlantic City property from 1994 to 2003. There were 412 permits. She narrowed them by contractor. She was looking for a single contractor or contracting company that had worked on the Ocean View Suites. On any property connected to the 1989 disappearance, she had found in a parallel search of cold cases, and on at least one property near the water treatment infrastructure on the southern end of the island. It took her 11 days. 11 days of permits and subcontractor records and corporate registration documents, and a database maintained by the New Jersey Department of Labor that nobody had thought to cross-reference before, because nobody had thought to ask the question this way before. The name that emerged was not a man's name. It was a company. Holloway Infrastructure Solutions, LLC, registered in Delaware in 1991, dissolved in 2006. The registered agent was a law firm in Wilmington that had since closed. The practical owner of record, buried in the subcontractor documentation, was a man named Paul Greer. Paul Greer did not appear in any criminal database. He had no arrests, no charges, no civil litigation on record, no restraining orders, nothing. He was 58 years old, and he lived in a two-story house in Margate City, 8 miles from the Atlantic City boardwalk. He had last filed taxes in 2019. According to records, he was retired. His former colleagues, reached through professional licensing records, described him consistently as quiet, reliable, the kind of man who showed up on a job and did the work, and did not make conversation. One former general contractor named Walt Hennessy, 70, reached by phone on a Thursday afternoon, said that Greer had been the best utility and substructure specialist he had ever worked with. He knew every building he touched, from the foundation up. He knew where the walls were hollow, where the original blueprints diverged from the actual construction, where you could gain space nobody on the surface knew existed. Walt Hennessy said this with professional admiration. Sarah wrote it down and felt a coldness behind her sternum that she recognized as certainty. She brought her findings to her lieutenant, Dennis Cho, on a Friday morning. Cho was a careful man who moved carefully through the world, and Sarah had worked with him for 9 years and trusted him precisely because he pushed back. He pushed back now. She had a dissolved LLC and a quiet retired subcontractor and a set of notebooks found in a demolished building. She had a theory of architectural access. She had 15 years of a case that had never been hers. Cho said, "What do you actually have that connects Greer to the room?" Sarah said, "His company pulled the permit for the concealed utility renovation on that corridor in 1997. 2 years before the women disappeared. He built that room, Dennis. He built it 2 years before he needed it." Cho authorized a background investigation and a surveillance detail. Not a search warrant. Not yet. The surveillance detail lasted 6 days. Paul Greer's daily life was unremarkable to the point of deliberate performance. He drove to a grocery store on Tuesdays. He drove to a hardware store on Thursdays. He walked on the beach in the mornings before 7. He received no visitors. He made no phone calls on a mobile phone that the surveillance unit could detect, though he had a landline registered to the address. He appeared in every observable detail to be a retired man living a retired man's life. On the 7th day, Sarah drove to the hardware store on a Thursday morning and walked the aisles until she found him in the electrical supplies section. She did not approach him. She watched him from one aisle over through the shelf gaps. He was a medium-height man with white hair cut close, broad hands, and the specific kind of stillness that belongs to people who have spent decades working in confined and concentrated spaces. He selected items slowly and with precision. He read every label twice. He placed each item in his basket as if it had a correct position. He never looked around him. That was what stayed with Sarah afterward. Most people in a public space perform a kind of ambient social awareness, glancing at strangers, adjusting their path to account for others. Paul Greer did not look around him. He moved through the store as if he were alone in it, as if other people were part of the scenery, and scenery did not require attention. She followed him to the checkout and then to his car. He drove north on a route that should have taken him home to Margate City. Instead, he turned east toward the old commercial district near the inlet. He parked outside a building Sarah recognized, the former Meridian Mall, a shopping center that had closed in 2011 and had been under slow and legally complicated renovation for 6 years. She knew the building. She had driven past it 100 times. She had never once thought about what was underneath it. She called in the location and sat in her car, watching the door Paul Greer had entered. She waited 38 minutes. He did not come back out. The search warrant for Paul Greer's residence turned up a filing cabinet in his basement that contained, among other things, architectural drawings. Detailed, hand-annotated drawings of 14 separate commercial properties in Atlantic City and 3 in the surrounding region. The annotations marked ventilation access points, decommissioned utility corridors, subfloor cavities, sealed maintenance tunnels. They marked them with small symbols Sarah did not immediately understand until she found, in a separate folder in the same cabinet, a legend, a handwritten key to the symbols. One symbol meant concealed access. One meant power source available. One meant acoustic isolation, meaning the space was insulated enough from the building above it that sound from within would not carry. The symbol that appeared most frequently on 11 of the 14 Atlantic City drawings was the one the legend identified as occupied. Sarah stood in Paul Greer's basement, holding those drawings, and felt the investigation shift beneath her like a change in weight distribution, like the first moment when a structure begins to move. She had thought she was looking at a cold case. She understood now that she was looking at something that had never stopped. The Meridian Mall became the focal point. 3 of the 14 annotated drawings showed the mall's substructure in progressively greater detail. The most recent, undated, but drawn on paper with a freshness that the State Forensic Lab later placed within the last 18 months. The mall drawings showed a network of tunnels and subsurface chambers in the building's foundation layer, some of which predated the mall itself, remnants of an industrial complex that had occupied the site in the 1960s and had been built over rather than demolished. Paul Greer had found them. Paul Greer had expanded them. Paul Greer had been working in them for, the lab estimated, at least the last 4 years. The mall's current renovation manager was a man named Carl Pitts, 44, who had been overseeing the stalled renovation project since 2021. He had hired Greer as a freelance substructure consultant the same year, on a recommendation from a former colleague. Carl Pitts told the police this voluntarily and with what appeared to be complete transparency. He said Greer had been helpful and professional. He said Greer had identified several previously unknown subsurface cavities that complicated the renovation planning. He said he had given Greer unlimited access to the site during and after construction hours, including a key card that allowed overnight entry, because Greer had explained that the subsurface survey work was easier to conduct without the ambient vibration of daytime construction activity. Carl Pitts had given Paul Greer the keys to a building with a labyrinth underneath it. Sarah looked at Carl Pitts across an interview table for a long time. She thought about what it meant to hand something terrible a door and call it professional courtesy. She did not believe Carl Pitts was complicit. She believed he was one of the many ordinary people through whom extraordinary evil moves without friction, because ordinary people do not look at a quiet, professional, reliable man and think, "There is a room under this building, and someone is inside it." Then, 19 days into the investigation, Lily Adams disappeared. She was 19, a sophomore at Stockton University in Atlantic City for a friend's birthday weekend. The friend had reported her missing Sunday morning after Lily had not returned to their shared hotel room following a late walk on the boardwalk Saturday night. The hotel was 3 blocks from the Meridian Mall. The security footage from the boardwalk showed Lily at 11:47 p.m. walking south, alone, earbuds in, hands in her jacket pockets. She turned onto a side street. The cameras did not follow. Sarah was at the police station at 6 in the morning when the missing persons report came in. She read the address of Lily's hotel and felt everything in her accelerate and go very still at the same time. She called Cho. She said, "We need to move on the mall today." She said, "He has someone." Cho said, "We need to be certain. A wrong move and he disappears." Sarah said, "If we wait to be certain, Lily Adams disappears." They moved at 7 that morning. Not Paul Greer's house, the mall. The tactical unit entered the Meridian Mall through the main construction entrance at 7:14. Sarah and 2 other detectives moved through the main building, while the tactical team went for the substructure access points that Greer's drawings had identified. The building smelled of concrete dust and raw wood, and the particular stagnant cold of spaces that have been closed too long. Emergency lighting ran along the main corridors in orange and white strips. Construction materials were stacked against the walls in the orderly way of a project that had been paused mid-step. The first substructure access point, behind a utility panel in the former food court area, was locked with a padlock that the tactical team cut in under 40 seconds. The ladder behind it descended into darkness. Sarah went down first. The tunnels were low-ceilinged and ran in straight lines, with junctions marked in spray paint that was clearly Greer's work, newer than the surrounding concrete. Battery-powered LED strips ran along the upper left corner of each tunnel, providing light that was pale and even, and somehow worse than darkness would have been. The air smelled of rock and standing water, and something else, something inhabited. They moved through 3 junctions before they found the first room. It was empty. But it was not abandoned. A folding cot, a battery lantern, a plastic bin of non-perishable food items, a length of rope secured to a bracket bolted into the wall. Sarah looked at the bracket and the bolt and thought about how long those bolts had been in that wall and what that length of time meant. The second junction led them deeper, and the ceiling dropped lower, and the air changed again, and then a tactical officer, 20 feet ahead of Sarah, stopped and held up a closed fist, the signal for everyone to freeze. In the silence, Sarah heard something. Very faint, irregular, the sound of someone moving in a constrained space. The room at the end of that passage was secured with a door that looked like a standard utility door, but had been retrofitted with a commercial-grade deadbolt that keyed from the outside only. The tactical officer used a hydraulic spreader. The door gave way in under a minute. Lily Adams was inside. She was seated on the floor with her back against the far wall, her wrists bound with zip ties in front of her, a length of cord attached to the zip ties and running to a bracket in the wall, giving her approximately 4 feet of movement. She looked up when the door opened, and her expression did not immediately resolve into relief. It resolved first into something that Sarah recognized. the face of someone who has spent hours or days preparing for the possibility that the next person through the door would not be the right kind of person. "Lily Adams?" Sarah said. The girl's face broke. She nodded. She started crying in the silent way of someone who has used up their voice. Sarah crossed the room and began cutting the zip ties and talking to Lily in the steady, low voice she had learned years ago was more useful than urgency. She said, "You're safe." She said, "We've got you." She said, "We're going to get you out of here right now." Lily, between ragged breaths, said, "He was here an hour ago. He told me to look at the wall." Sarah looked at the wall. On it, at eye level for someone seated on the floor, Lily had scratched marks into the concrete with what turned out to be a piece of metal she had worked loose from the bracket over several hours. Not random marks, a series of numbers and letters. Lily had been recording sounds, mechanical sounds, water sounds, the patterns of activity she could hear through the walls and ceiling. She had been building a map of the space around her, the way Rachel Ortiz had built a map 25 years ago. The way a person who will not be erased builds evidence of their own existence out of whatever material is available. One of the letter-number sequences she had scratched into the wall matched the identifier on a HVAC unit in the northeast section of the mall's substructure. It was a section they had not yet cleared. Paul Greer was in that section. He had a secondary exit prepared. He was 7 minutes from using it when the tactical unit found him. He did not run. He sat down on the floor of the tunnel when he saw the tactical lights coming toward him, and he placed his hands flat on his thighs, and he looked at the lights with the same expression he had used in the hardware store. Focused, entirely without panic, as if he were simply waiting for the next step in a process. "The other locations," Sarah said when she stood in front of him. "Tell me about the other locations." Paul Greer looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I think you already know there are others. I think that's why you found me." He was not wrong. Sarah did already know. She had been carrying that knowledge since she had looked at those architectural drawings in his basement and seen the symbol that meant occupied appearing on buildings in other cities. Trenton, Philadelphia, Wilmington. She had known it, and she had not said it aloud because saying it aloud before they had Lily Adams would have split the investigation in a direction she could not control, and Lily Adams had been the priority. Now Lily Adams was on a stretcher outside the mall with 2 paramedics and a police chaplain and her own mother, who had driven from Egg Harbor Township in 50 minutes in response to a phone call Sarah had authorized before they even reached the tunnel. Because Sarah believed in the specific cruelty of making a parent wait 1 second longer than necessary for the word that their child was alive. Now Sarah stood in a tunnel under a derelict shopping mall and looked at Paul Greer and felt the weight of every case he represented pressing down through the ceiling above her like the full tonnage of the building. The investigation that followed the arrest of Paul Greer lasted 16 months and ultimately connected him to the disappearances of 29 women across 6 cities in the Mid-Atlantic region, spanning from 1991 to the date of his arrest. The connections were architectural. He had worked on every building. He had built every room. He had left the same marks, the same brackets, the same retrofitted door hardware, the same battery-powered lighting systems in the same configuration. Remains were recovered from the subsurface cavity beneath the former Ocean View Suites site, from a sealed chamber beneath a parking structure in Trenton that had been demolished in 2018 and never fully excavated, and from a location in the Pinelands, 40 miles west of Atlantic City, that Greer eventually identified during a plea negotiation that stretched across 8 months and produced in Sarah a revulsion so comprehensive it occasionally manifested as a physical symptom, a tightness in the jaw, a weight behind the eyes. Donna Reyes, Kim Baxter, Rachel Ortiz. Their families were notified within the same week in November of that year. Sarah made 2 of the 3 calls herself. She sat in her car outside the police station for 20 minutes before the first one, her phone in her hand, because she was trying to find something adequate to say to a 71-year-old woman who had waited 25 years and deserved more than a phone call from a detective she had never met. She could not find anything adequate. She called anyway. She said what she had, which was the truth and a specific gravity of sorrow. And the woman on the other end of the line said thank you, and then said nothing else for a very long time. And Sarah sat with her in that silence because it was what was needed, and because it was all she had. Lily Adams recovered. She testified. She became, in the press coverage that followed, the face of survival that a story this size required, though Sarah noticed that Lily herself seemed uncomfortable with the role, more interested in the notebooks than in her own experience, more interested in Rachel and Kim and Donna than in the version of herself that the media was constructing. She visited the Atlantic City Police Department twice after her release from the hospital. The second time, she asked to see the notebooks. Sarah sat with her while she read them. She did not say anything. Neither did Lily. They sat in the same conference room where Sarah had read the notebooks herself 18 months earlier, and the room held both of them in its institutional quiet, and outside the window, Atlantic City did what Atlantic City always did, which was shine. Paul Greer received 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, on charges that included kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and first-degree murder. The sentencing hearing lasted 3 days, and his expression throughout it was the same one Sarah had seen in the tunnel: focused, still, entirely without the quality of a man who understood that what he had done was wrong in the way that wrong is supposed to register in the human nervous system. At his sentencing, before the judge pronounced the sentence, Paul Greer was given the opportunity to address the court. He said, "I am very good at finding the spaces inside things that other people don't see. I want that to be on record, that I was very good at it." Sarah was in the courtroom. She had been there every day of the trial. She looked at Paul Greer when he said that, and she thought about the 14 annotated drawings in his filing cabinet, and the symbol that had appeared on buildings in other cities. And she thought about a task force investigation that had been running for 7 months across 4 state jurisdictions, trying to identify every location Greer had ever worked in, and determine whether every one of those locations had been fully, truly, exhaustively searched. She thought about the symbol the legend identified as occupied. She thought about the fact that Greer had worked on buildings she did not have records for yet, buildings predating the accessible permit database, buildings in cities the task force had not yet reached. She thought about how many people in how many American cities were walking every day through buildings they believed were simply buildings, not understanding that a quiet man with an excellent eye for hollow spaces had once stood in those buildings and seen something else entirely. The sentence was read. Paul Greer was taken from the courtroom. Sarah sat in her seat for a moment after the room emptied, looking at the empty defendant's chair. She had saved Lily Adams. That was real. That was permanent. That could not be taken back. But on her phone, in a secure case management app, was a spreadsheet with 22 rows. Each row was a property in a different city. Each row had a date when Greer was documented to have worked on that property. None of those rows had been checked yet. None of those buildings had been searched yet. And some of those buildings, according to the task force's preliminary analysis, had subsurface structures that predated the current buildings by decades. If this story stays with you the way it stayed with Sarah, if you find yourself thinking about those 22 rows and what might be at the end of each one, subscribe now. Every week, we go deeper into the cases that refuse to close, the investigations that outlast the verdicts, the questions that a sentence cannot answer. The next chapter is already waiting. Sarah stood, picked up her bag, and walked out of the courtroom into a hallway that smelled of floor wax and institutional coffee, and the particular neutral air of a building designed to contain human pain without absorbing it. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button for the ground floor. She stood in the elevator and looked at the spreadsheet on her phone. Row 7. A building in Wilmington, Delaware. A former textile facility converted to mixed-use residential in 2003. Greer had pulled the substructure renovation permit in 2001. The task force had flagged it as a priority, but had not yet obtained a court order to enter the residential units above the substructure level. The current building manager had been cooperative. The current building manager's name appeared in Greer's personal phone records in a call made 6 weeks before his arrest. The elevator opened. Sarah walked through the lobby and out into the Atlantic City afternoon. The light off the ocean was the color it always was in November, white and flat and without comfort. The boardwalk was 2 blocks away. She could hear it faintly, the particular sound signature of a space designed for distraction. She opened the spreadsheet and typed a note in row 7. Priority. Call the Wilmington office. Today. Paul Greer, in a maximum security facility in Trenton, was settling into his cell at approximately this same moment. He had been assigned a top bunk. He had looked at the cell for a long time when the door first closed behind him. Then he had sat on the lower edge of the bunk and pressed both hands flat on his thighs, the same gesture as in the tunnel, the gesture of a man waiting for the next step in a process. He had said what he wanted to say on the record, that he was very good at finding the spaces inside things that other people don't see. He had not said how many of those spaces he had found. He had not said what was in all of them. He had answered every question his attorney advised him to answer, and had declined every question his attorney had advised him to decline, and the task force's reconstruction of his activities was thorough and serious, and would eventually, Sarah believed, be good. Eventually. And here is what nobody said at the sentencing, what the prosecutor did not say, and the defense did not say, and the judge did not say. Paul Greer had been arrested with a phone. On that phone, in an encrypted folder that the Digital Forensics Unit had spent 4 months partially reconstructing, were photographs. Not of buildings, not of architectural drawings. Photographs of women in public spaces. Women who did not know they were being photographed. Women in cities Sarah's task force had not yet reached. The metadata on the most recent photograph was dated 9 days before his arrest. The location data embedded in that file pointed to a city 300 miles from Atlantic City. A city where Greer had no documented work history, no known associates, no paper trail of any kind. A city where, as of the day Sarah stood in that elevator looking at her spreadsheet, the task force had not yet begun to look. That is where we leave Sarah Miller. Not at a resolution, not at a closed door, at a spreadsheet with 22 rows and a phone with a photograph and a city whose name she had written at the top of a new page in her notebook that morning and underlined twice. If you believe, as Sarah does, that the only thing worse than knowing is almost knowing, leave a comment below. Tell us which city you think it is. Tell us what you would do with row 7. Tell us whether you think Paul Greer told the truth when he said he was very good at finding the spaces inside things that other people don't see, or whether you think he was, even then, in that courtroom, in that last public moment, still performing. Still directing attention toward what he wanted you to see and away from what he didn't. The ocean light shifted. The spreadsheet had 22 rows. Sarah got in her car and drove north toward the inlet, toward the office, toward row 7 and everything after it. The building in Wilmington was still standing. Somewhere inside it, below the floor level of the apartments where people cooked dinner and watched television and believed themselves to be living in an ordinary building, there might be nothing. There might simply be concrete and old pipes and the residue of an industrial past. Or there might be a battery-powered LED strip running along the upper left corner of a tunnel wall, and at the end of that tunnel, a door with a commercial-grade deadbolt that keyed from the outside only, and on the other side of that door, a darkness that a quiet and meticulous man had spent 30 years making very, very difficult to find. Sarah Miller drove north and did not allow herself to stop thinking about it. That was the only thing she had learned that she could actually control. Subscribe if you can't stop thinking about it either.